The influence of the French New Wave helps explain a lot of what's happening in Hollywood during the 1960s in terms of visual style, in terms of the kind of tone or spirit of movies. But just as important as that, and in fact, if not more important, are important social changes that are occurring. And for this week, the sort of major social change that I want to focus on is the emergence of youth culture. Right? That in the 1950s, there emerges for the first time a distinct youth culture, a culture of youth, unlike at any other time in history. And so these people who are sort of young and coming of age in the 50s are the very ones who are now in their who are now making movies in the late 60s and early 70s. And to understand this emergence of youth culture, we have to look at three factors: high schools, the invention or emergence of transistor technology, and the sort of emergence of the third space. Okay, so when we think of high school, we think of something like this, right? Well, okay, maybe not everyone is this happy and not everyone sings and dances this way, whatever. But basically, when we think of high school, we think of young people, free-spirited, kind of doing what they do and all that good stuff, right? And in fact, this was not true for most of history, and definitely was not true for most of American history. In 1930, about 35% of all Americans went to high school. By 1960, that number became closer to 70%. And today, we're at about 90-95%. Right? Now think about that. In 1930, only 35% of all Americans went to high school. In other words, most Americans did not go to high school. Most Americans stopped going to school after the 7th or 8th grade, and they would instead just go get jobs, because the kind of jobs that most people could get, you really didn't need an education beyond 7th grade. I mean, if your job is going to be working in a factory, putting together parts for cars, or if your job is working out on the farm, right? Basically, as long as you know how to read and you can do simple math, that's really all you needed. Right. Now think about what that means. Think about how different your life would have been had there been no high school. That had you sort of, again, after 6th or 7th grade, you just kind of went to work, right? You didn't have high school friends to hang out with. There was no high school culture, right? You're not hanging out with other people your age because you're busy working. Well, that's what most of life was like before 1945. That, again, most Americans simply just kind of, or not just Americans, but most people in the world simply, once you get 12 or 13, you're basically an adult, and you're not doing kid things, right? Some of you might have heard the old cliche that, the 30 is the new 20, right? Or 40 is the new 30. That somehow, like, today's 40-year-olds act like yesterday's 30-year-olds. And I think part of that has to do with the ways in which things like high school and now college keep pushing back that sort of line of adulthood, right? That as more and more people continue on in their education, they sort of have to deal with being an adult much later in life. This little shot here is from a series of films made in the 1930s called the Bowery Boys. And these kids are basically high school age. I mean, these are like 15, 16-year-old kids. The thing is, this is the 1930s. So they don't go to high school, and they don't, hang out and go to the prom, whatever. These kids are basically poor urban kids who spend most of their time, robbing folks or running from the police. They're kind of basically tough street kids. And again, that's really like kind of, what most people did. That you either had a job in a factory, in the farm, or you just hung out in the streets. And there was, again, no sense of teen culture. So high school, the invention of the modern high school and the increased enrollment of young people into high schools begins to sort of foster this unique teen culture that now, for the first time in history, a majority of teenagers are spending most of their time not under the supervision of adults like in an office or at home, but at school. And sure, there are teachers and principals, but let's face it, at school, most of the activities are built around socializing, right? In between classes, after school, before school, various activities. Right? And so there's this increased autonomy, this kind of area in which kids are basically just being kids. And this, again, is something very, very new. Now, the next thing in the development of youth culture starts with the invention of the transistor. And this is actually a mock-up of the first transistor. It's kind of big and bulky. Today's transistors are basically microchips. Microchips are transistors, right? And that's like the size of a breadcrumb. But in the 1940s and 1950s, once they sort of figured this out, they were able to make transistors that were about the size of a nickel, right? Which is pretty darn small. And what transistors did was allow us to replace vacuum tubes. See, now here's a modern vacuum tube, and this thing is probably about this whole thing is probably about the size of a shoebox. And this is actually a modern tube amplifier. This is about the size of a shoebox. Now, if you wanted the same level of power using a transistor, using transistor technology, you could take this thing that's the size of a shoebox and probably make it about the size of an iPod. That's how much you could shrink things down. Now, why is all this important? Well, it begins with the radio. And here is sort of a picture of the classic antique radio. Or maybe I should just call it a classic 1920s radio, since it wasn't an antique in the 1920s. Now, these radios are driven by tubes, right? So this is before transistors were invented. Now, these radios were big and heavy and very expensive. That a radio like this, and this is probably a smaller version of the old tube radios, that this would probably be about, I'd say, maybe about 2.5, 3 feet tall, about a foot and a half wide. For an average family, this would cost, close to $800-900, right? Some of the bigger, nicer ones would be, again, in today's money, not back then, but in today's the equivalent of today's dollars, we're talking like a couple $1,000s. In other words, radios were expensive, right? Today you can buy a radio for like $5, like just a plain old radio. But these radios were expensive, which meant that most families could only have one radio, and that radio was going to be usually in the family room. Kids did not have control of the radio. Parents did, which meant the kids would listen to what the parents wanted to listen to, right? There was no independence from the parents. And if you look at sort of music history, throughout American music history, sure, there are changes in the style of music, and music, from decade to decade definitely is different, but those differences are very subtle, right? But suddenly, in the 1950s, with the invention of the transistor, we have this kind of radio. These radios are about the size, maybe a little bit bigger than the typical iPod, or actually like an iPod Touch, right, or an iPhone. That's about the size of these things. And by today's standards, the technology is rather crude. This is just basically an AM radio. But the thing is, these things were cheap. The average teenager could probably save up enough money, from like about 5-6 months worth of allowance, and they can get one of these radios. It had a little speaker. It had, you can see, a headphone jack for basically these little earbuds. Now all of a sudden, kids had independence away from their parents and were able to choose what they wanted to listen to. And of course, what they wanted to listen to was this new form of music called rock and roll. Right? The difference between sort of music between the 50s and 40s is a huge jump compared to everything that came before it, and has a lot to do, again, with this transistor technology. So that because kids were, again, given a much greater sense of independence. Just like in high school, where they're not under adult supervision in the same way they were in the past, with the transistor radio, kids are now choosing whatever they want to listen to. The third and final factor that takes us into youth culture, the development of youth culture, is this thing called the third space. Right? Now, typically, when sociologists talk about third spaces, what they mean is, well, first space is your home. The second space is school or work, depending on your situation, right? So first space is your home, second space is school or work. Third space is the sort of place of recreation, the place in which your duties, obligations are much lighter. A place where you can kind of stretch the boundaries of who you are and test out who you are. It's a space of leisure, and it's a space of self-defining. Right? For some people, for adults, it might be a golf course or a bowling alley. Right? For kids, of course, third spaces tend to be unchaperoned spaces. Like today, or back then in the 50s, you had, the malt shop, right? These kids would go there after school, and it was a place just full of kids, and they're listening to get to their rock and roll, they're drinking their malt shakes, and they're just hanging out, right? And that's the key. It's a place where they just hang out. Today, of course, we have plenty of other third spaces. Today, people hang out at coffee shops, right? And of course, there's sort of the classic teenage hangout space, which is the shopping mall. Um, to some extent, we can even think of websites like Facebook or MySpace as being kind of the virtual or online versions of the third space. In other words, any place where kids can hang out relatively free from parental supervision, right? And so this idea of a third space really sort of first comes into existence for teenagers in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, so we don't lose focus, I just want to remind you, right, the importance of all this is that this first generation of teenagers, this first generation of Americans who, basically invent what today we call the generation gap, right? The people who are 15 or 16 years old in 1955, 1956 are the very same people who are now going to be, close to 30 years old in 1970, and these are the people again who are making the movies of the new Hollywood. These people are that first truly teen generation, right? Okay, so let's move on to the next section in which I'll briefly talk about film schools.